So I wanted to take a minute or two to talk about some of the opening puzzles in The Witness, mostly as just possibly a prelude to a talk that I am planning on doing. This is not what I want to do. I want to invert Y. Okay. So mostly I want to talk about nonverbal communication through puzzle design and level design, and just the way in which this game kind of creates this, by design, there's like a series of things that are supposed to go through your head, or might go through your head, right? Now, a lot of games don't do things this way. They do things with a very explicit verbal communication. Hey, those guys are shooting us. You need to take them out, or whatever, something like that, right? They try to fit it into the world in a way to where it feels natural, but it's still communicated to you verbally what you need to do. This game does almost all of its communication non-verbally, right? Like, that's kind of the point of the game. Any of the verbal stuff is not puzzle related. It's not gameplay related. So now, obviously, unfortunately, games nowadays have to have some level of verbal communication at the start, just to tell you what the controls are, because controls in games are very complicated. Mostly because we have these things, and they've got all these buttons all over them, and they've got buttons up here too, and these things are buttons too, don't you know? And like, there's a little pad here, whatever. So, the game, of course, has to tell you that you use the stick to move around. But even at that, like, if you chose to look around, you're sort of locked into this view so that you can't look back into the darkness. So it's, I mean, that's not really a communication thing, but in some sense maybe it is, because it points you in the right direction, right? You're supposed to go forward. That is what you're supposed to do. That's really all you can do. And beyond that, like, there's the long tunnel with the light at the end of it, so you're sort of drawn to the light, right? And then also, because, like I said, these controllers, you do have to have some level of nonverbal, or some level of verbal communication here. It's done in a very kind of limited fashion, I guess you could say, in that it's just pictorial. Here's a picture of a button with A on it, right? But even at that, it's like, it doesn't tell you that you need to go over here and hit A again. It's just still got A on the screen, and this little thing is blipping, right? So it's trying to communicate to you something that you need to do without using any kind of verbiage, right? It's like, okay, I guess maybe I go over here and hit A again. It's like, oh, okay, that works. And then the endpoint blips, right? So it's like, okay, you know, eventually maybe you figure out what you need to do. Now it flashes and it comes up A again. So it's some level of verbal communication required, right, for the basics. But yeah, so, and then you basically have another panel here, which doesn't give you any of that information, but presumably you kind of get it, right, already. So you get to this panel and you say, oh, well, maybe I should do the same thing. I should hit A. And then you popped in here, and then it still has the little blinky thing. But it doesn't really tell you anything anymore, right? And this is kind of intended to show you that sometimes there's curves in them, and actually it sort of, if you're even slightly going off to the left, it automatically goes around the corner. Anyway, yeah, so you basically, you just have to do something simple, right? Now, that's the thing is, right, these are puzzles, right, under the definition of what this game considers a puzzle. These are puzzles, but like, these are super simple. These are not what you would normally consider puzzles, because they're not challenging, they're not difficult, they're not hard to solve. You're not stumped on them for hours. Now, of course, there's puzzles in the game that might do that, but these are not intended to do that. And that's the entire point, I guess, that I want to make, is like, you can use puzzles or just general level design and things like that in a way that is not traditional. So again, we've got a long hallway with a light at the end of it. And as we head out here, there's framed right forward is a puzzle panel. Now if we look to the right, there's no puzzle panel. If you look to the left, there's a wall. So the reasonable thing to do is to continue walking straight, right? And also, you know, a nice side effect is this puzzle panel and the goal, which is the top of a mountain peak, are both framed here very nicely as you come out of this hallway. Like, it's not the mountain, which is actually the goal, is the first thing that you see, and then you see a panel, and it's like, okay, well, I guess I should go to that panel first, and maybe you see the mountain off in the distance and think, oh, well, maybe I'll get to that later. So, of course, by this point, you've been playing long enough that you have done 2 of these panels, and you know, okay, I know exactly what to do here, right? So we get to this panel, and we hit the start point, we know that, and then it's like, okay, we go to the end point. And so this panel immediately is trying to tell you something else, right? Or it's showing you something that doesn't fit with what you've been shown before, which is maybe, if you don't notice, I mean, maybe you noticed that the endpoint was blinking, right? And then you're like, oh, okay. Like, it's not intended, again, it's not intended to be a really challenging puzzle, but there's a few different things here. You might go around here and go up here and get to an endpoint and realize, okay, I can't do that. That just canceled me out. Or you might go up here and think like, okay, I'll loop around. And you might learn that, oh, I can't cross over myself. And so eventually, of course, you'd make it to this point, right? And solve the puzzle, right? It's not much of a puzzle, really, but it is intended to communicate some things. Namely that in addition to starting at a circle point, you need to end at a rounded point. You can't end at a square point. Like, it's only rounded points that you can end at on a panel. And then after we solve that, this wire, which is prominently in view, lights up, which naturally will guide the player to look at the wire and follow it this way, right? I mean, maybe they could look around, but most people are probably going to do that. Are going to look and see, oh, this laser or this wire lit up. Maybe I should look at that. But you could, of course, wander around, and eventually you might get bored, or you might realize that there's this gate over here. But in terms of the line of communication that you're quote-unquote intended to get, right? Because that's the thing about doing this type of design or whatever, is like there's no forcing on it, right? You're not boxing the player in and making them experience this thing, which is like what most games do with tutorializing, is you have to do this exact way. Like, if you wanted to, in that starting room back there, you can, once you get to the panel at the end, you can turn around and walk back into the blackness. Like, there's no, it doesn't stop you from doing that. If that's what you really wanted to do, then okay. Like, that's fine. But so you're really giving the player like the opportunity to have a certain line of thought or series of discoveries, right? So we know we solved a puzzle and a wire lit up. The wire goes down here and crosses over a wire which is not lit up. You know, because you could just have the wire go down here, but by specifically crossing over a wire that is not lit up, you give the player 2 options, basically. They can either follow the wire that's not lit up and find a puzzle panel that they can't use. So they go over here and they see, okay, this looks like a panel, but I can't use it, right? So you have that option. Or you have the option to follow it the other way and see that there's a panel over here that's hooked up to this. Maybe that has something to do with it. Either way, you get the idea that there's, if you didn't notice before, you might notice now that there's a wire that is lit up and a wire that isn't, so probably you need to light the other wire up too, right? Okay, so then we follow this wire over here, and there's a wall. The wire goes over the wall, so we can't just straight follow the wire anymore, so we kind of have to go around, and we probably look around the wall and see, oh, okay, there's a panel right here. You know, it's right next to where we had to go over the wall. Now that, in some sense, right, is a puzzle too, right? I mean, it's not, again, it's not a, I don't know, it's hard to say, like, puzzle, right? But it's not, it's a nonverbal communication thing, right? It was like, hey, this game is about, like, noticing things and rewarding you for noticing things. And in this case, you noticed that this went over here, and so you decided to look over here, and then the panel is right there. Okay, so again, we have another panel, right? And it's like, oh, okay, I know what to do. I've done this before. Oh, I've done this like 4 times already. So, okay, we'll hit the start point. But this particularly is to tell you sometimes the start point is kind of like hidden in the middle or something, right? Like it might not be super obvious. And not only that, but from the start point, you might be able to go multiple different ways. You might be able to go right or down or left or whatever. And again, you're given opportunities to play around or screw up or whatever. And you've got different endpoints. Now, again, you know, it's not a hard thing. These are very simple puzzles. But my reasoning for doing this, for even talking this much about puzzles that are so simple that most people would not even think about them as puzzles, is to talk about nonverbal communication in video games and how you do it. And this game does it very well, so it's interesting to talk about, right? So again, like, this is reinforcing that same idea that you've seen before, which is like that an endpoint needs to look a certain way, even though it flashes for a heck of a long time. There's a little blip there. I don't know if it does it forever, but it definitely flashes for a long time. I guess it does do it forever. So, you know, it's constantly telling you, this is the endpoint, this is the endpoint. Like, you could go past the endpoint, whatever. So there's opportunities to screw up there. Again, another wire lights up. Well, we know last time we followed a wire, and it took us to a puzzle panel. And it's like, oh, well, look, again, it goes out of view. It's like, well, I don't really know where the wire went exactly. But if we were just straight following the wire, that would not be that interesting, right? It would be kind of a boring thing. It's like, oh, we'll just go to the next thing. But instead, we're given this opportunity to go in here and look and say, oh, yeah, well, the wire came down from up there. All right. So again, we're also rewarded for using the knowledge that we got before that, oh, probably if the wire goes over something, it's probably on the other side of this wall. So again, there's another panel here. And this panel is, at this point, there's nothing new that this panel does. It's doing an increase in complexity. So that brings me to another thing that I want to talk about, which is the way in which you structure a sequence to create kind of an interesting dynamic, right? And there's kind of 2 stages to this. One stage is what this has done so far, which is called establishing parameters, I guess you could say. It's where you very clearly are teaching the player something. The puzzles that you're doing are not intended to be puzzles so much or be that difficult. They're just intended to communicate something in a straightforward way, but non-verbally, which means that you really kind of limit the complexity, right? So then the next thing that you do, or you can do, is within those parameters that you've established, you can increase the complexity of the challenge. So that is all this is, right? This is something we've done before. You know, there's a starting point. At this point, it's maybe a little smaller, but that's not really much of a challenge. And then there's an end point. However, the panel itself is much bigger and much more complicated, and it's much more likely, because it's just closer to what you would consider a standard maze, right, that the player will make mistakes and dead ends and fiddle around with this for a while and eventually get to the end, right? So it's a harder maze puzzle, but it's not really that difficult still, right? We're still obviously in easy zone with this game. Just continue to do that. Okay, so now I hit this thing. I also noticed, now I'm not sure if the other ones made this sound, but I also noticed at this point that there was a ping metal noise off in that direction, right? So, again, the wire lit up, so we follow the wire back out. And maybe at this point we notice, oh yeah, I remember this wire. Well, I guess I lit that up, so I guess I'm done. And so we go over here. And oh, okay, here's the metal thing that I heard earlier. So maybe, as a player, you decide, oh, I think I'm going to go ahead and check this panel out, because now I have access to it, I guess, because I can see this dot. Or maybe you don't. And at this point, you might try to draw a line, and you realize you can't because the thing's covered up. Which at this point, maybe you don't really realize the game is telling you this, but the game is definitely telling you if there's something in the way, you can't trace a line. Like if something's covering up the panel, you can't trace it. Because otherwise you might think, oh, well, I could probably trace underneath things, right? But instead it's saying, well, if there's something in front of the panel and you can't see the lines, you can't trace. It's like, okay, well, I guess I'm kind of screwed at this point, right? So now at this point there are 2 wires coming out here, and we have, again, the choice to follow 2 different wires. We can either go this way or we can go this way. And I believe, I'm not entirely certain, but I believe it does not matter which way we go. We can pick whichever one we want. But we'll see. So we follow this wire over. It goes over a wall again. Well, we've seen that before, so it probably goes around to the other side. So let's go over. Hey, here it is. Here is the wire. So then we go over here, and we find a panel. Hey, look. So I believe at this point you do have a choice. Like you can do this panel or that panel. As far as I know, yeah. See, it doesn't matter. And that's the thing, is like part of designing things this way is to, at some point, when you can, give the player a choice, right? Because here it's like, well, they can choose to go this way or that way. It's whichever way they want to go. And it would be terrible if you said, okay, through this whole sequence, like you're just going to have to go from panel to panel to panel, right? And just follow the wires. So at this point it's saying, well, sometimes you'll have a choice about which way you want to go. But I'm going to go to this one first, because that last one I want to talk about something about it specifically. So now this panel is teaching you something, which is, this is the first panel that has had multiple start points. It's like, okay, well, does it matter which one I pick? So of course we, pick one, and get to the exit. Now, of course I got to the exit, I can go ahead and solve it, but I want to point out, most of the panels have started in the lower left or just somewhere in the middle or whatever. Like there's not a lot that start over here, so if the player, for example, picked over here, eventually they would realize that there's no way to actually solve it from this point. But maybe you don't realize that. Maybe you just happen to pick this and don't think about it. But either way, the panel gives you the option, at least, to discover that sometimes there's multiple starting points and maybe only one of them works. Again, another thing opens up. Maybe we just follow this back because we don't remember, and then of course we can see the other wire still. Maybe we try this again. Who knows? Like there's a lot of options of what you might do. And again, that's something I want to emphasize about this type of design, is that it is very much open to the player, right? Like you're not designing something that's like rigidly the player is going to have this exact experience. Like you're just giving the player the option to have this exact experience, or just to have, you're guiding them in a way, right? Gently, but not forcefully. Anyway, it's really kind of weird way to put it, but it's true. The player's free to go and look around at things. Like, that's why there's stuff in here to look around at. But I'm just talking mechanically at this point. Okay, so now we have another puzzle, which is something that I wanted to talk about, is like the next step, in a way. Which maybe the other one is too, right? They're both they give you this option. Now these are of course very basic versions of this thing. I'm not sure what to call this phenomenon that this puzzle does, but it is a point at which you give the player something. It's like a curveball, right? You're throwing them something that they're not used to, that is not particularly within what they've been taught already. Like at this point, every puzzle that you've done, you draw from a start to an end point, and then you progress in the game, right? But this one, which if you played the game, now if you played the game, but if not, it's like, okay, well, I'll follow the wire back, or maybe I don't even follow it back. I just run back over here because I know, oh, and I heard the noise, so maybe I thought that was this opening up. And I get back here, and of course it's like still not working. So again, this is all very simple, but I only picked this because two reasons really why I picked these puzzles. One, they're very early puzzles, so I can totally spoil everything out of them and not feel like, if you haven't played this game, that I'm ruining the game for you. And two, to emphasize that even when the game seems like it's not doing very much, there's a lot of thought and care put into it. And so that is kind of what you should strive for with your own games, I feel like. So here's this kind of curveball thing, right? Which is where the player realizes, oh, okay, well, I guess sometimes certain endpoints are not going to help me either. And so then we realize, oh, okay, we can go past that endpoint, and there's another endpoint down here. Because maybe you didn't even notice there were two endpoints. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, that one turned off, and then we go back here. Now, the other thing about this, which I'll get to in a second, which maybe this is a slight spoiler, but hopefully you played the game if you're watching this, but even if you haven't, this is a minor thing. So, of course, as I said before, we've seen many, many times that a wire that goes over a wall probably comes down on the other side. Like, it doesn't just end. It probably comes down and, like, connects to something, right? So, if you're an astute player and you've been thinking about this, then you'll probably think, I bet that other solution actually does something, too. Now, of course, we get over to this thing, which is a little weird, but I don't know. And so, thus far in the game, we've seen that, like, if you draw to an endpoint, and if it's the only endpoint, you progress, right? So this works the same way, more or less. You know, now if you're a particular curious player, you might fiddle around with this and see, okay, what happens if I solve it like another way? And it doesn't seem to matter, right? It seems like all solutions there are valid. Okay, so the other thing I want to say, which is again, like, I guess taking this to the next level or whatever, but maybe not so much. It's an opportunity for surprise, right? Is like, if we solve this another way, we do know that that goes up and out a window, so possibly if we could get over there, there might be something, right? And at this point, it doesn't appear to matter that this thing's closed, even though before it did, because this gate is already open, which is a little strange, but that's good enough for you. It's good enough for me, right? So we're thinking, okay, let's go over here, because I know, like, that wire went up and out this window. I think it was here. I'm not sure. And it's like, oh, sure enough, there's the wire coming out here. And then it opens up this gate, right? So, I could, of course, go on and on and on, and there's lots of sequences in the game that communicate different things. But just for the starting sequence of puzzles, I think that is a pretty good assessment and analysis of, like, what they're doing, right? I may come back to and look at some other puzzles in the game, but I just felt like I would throw this together because I'm trying to think about this type of design and how to communicate to people, like in a talk or something, how it works, how it looks, and how to do it. And, like, part one of that, I guess, is how it works and how it looks, and then part two of it is how to do it. Anyway, so that's how it works, or at least how it looks, right? So thanks for watching, I guess. I'll see you all later. And if you like this video, as usual, I have a Patreon. It's in the links down there in the description, and you can go throw me a couple bucks or whatever, and you'll get stuff like this early. And I also do some analysis videos that are exclusive to backers. Anyway, so see you, and thank you for watching.